Maybe just by way of introducing Andy here, by all outward appearances, Power Africa has survived the political the political transition. It is now a congressionally authorized, bipartisan sort of force that is, a real institution in the energy access space, and it's become, excuse me, a model, I think, for one, how private sector oriented development works, right? And number two, how the U.S. government can cut across different departments and different agencies and really coordinate towards a common goal. So Andy deserves a huge amount of credit for that. So congratulations, and thanks for joining me here. So how has Power Africa's strategy evolved during that time? And what are the lessons that we've learned since the rollout of Power Africa, and how is that reflected in the strategy today?
Sure. So thanks, everyone, for coming, and thank you, Jonathan, who is part of the Power Africa team, so he gets a lot of credit for where we are today, and thanks, Jim, who's been an early supporter, and Duke for hosting this event. We've learned quite a bit over the last few years, and I am extremely optimistic about not just where we are, but where the sector is going on the whole. Jim mentioned that you're still going to look at 500 million people who aren't going to have access to electricity. But I think the other thing that was in an IEA report that said that for the first time, starting in around 2013 or 2014, the number of people who are gaining access to electricity is actually exceeding the population growth in Africa. So we're putting a little bit of a dent in it. But when I say we, I'm not talking about the U.S. government and all of our partners. I'm talking about the private sector. And what the private sector is doing in the off-grid space is really going to drive is going to continue to drive the market and drive the number of connections. So a few things that we've learned, because when I think about Power Africa, we have sort of a view over the entire ecosystem, both the on-grid and the off-grid. And I always try to think towards the future and what it looks like and then work our way back. A few months ago, I got in a lot of arguments with one of our teams in a country because one of our private sector partners was pushing on a small solar project. I think it was 8 megawatts, and they said, all right, we'll do a 2-megawatt project, and the team at the embassy there was saying, well, there's just not going to be demand for the power. And I said, this is a country that has about 2% connectivity, and I get it that there's plenty of power generation, but don't tell me that there's not going to be demand for this extra power when you only have 2% of the people connected. The problem is transmission and distribution. We have to create that demand. There is the demand. It's just, the current customers might not have that demand. But we started looking closely because we were getting this type of pushback from teams at embassies across the continent. And we started looking at the expected supply and demand curves in the next 5 years in countries. And when Power Africa first was launched, it was all about big megawatts, big megawatts. We launched it, and we said we're going to do 30,000 megawatts. Most people didn't know what a megawatt was, but it sounded good. And then you had AFDB. They launched their Light Up in Power Africa. They said we're going to do 160,000 megawatts and by 2025. Like, okay, great. And then you had the Africa Renewable Energy Initiative, where everyone got together and said, we're going to do 300,000 megawatts by 2030 of just renewables. And we're sitting there looking at this. We're tracking the deal flow. And everyone has our app. It's the Power Africa tracking tool. It's available on iPhone. You can look at it. Publicly, we're tracking over 400 deals. And even like with the fossil fuel deals, you're not going to be at 300,000 megawatts. And internally, we're at about 800 deals, which is about 70,000 megawatts, and not all those will come online. The bottom line, though, is there's a lot of deal flow there, and we no longer need to be in the role of trying to push, try to generate interest in new deals. We need to make sure that the deals that are happening actually get online, and that the power can be transmitted and it can be distributed. Now, well, I'll let you ask another question. So we're focusing more now on transmission and distribution in the key enabling environment because it's great to have all this deal flow, but if people are changing the rules of the game and they don't know how to negotiate the deals and how to implement them, they're not going to go anywhere.
So on the grid side, I want to hear how the shift has been reflected in programming on the off-grid side too. But on grid, projects are slow, infrastructure is hard, even in OECD countries. Have you seen places where it's been done well and where you're encouraged and where power plants in kind of grid infrastructure are happening? And do we have that model yet to look to? And and try to replicate?
So there are places, look, people will come to me and ask me which countries I like, and it used to be easy. I'm like, at one point I'll say, hey, take a look at Rwanda, and then you realize, wait, all right, there's too much deal flow there. And look at, everybody wants to come into Kenya. Well, Kenya's got pretty good deal flow. Everyone gets paid on time there. It's a pretty well-developed market. So you're saying everybody wants to go there, but if you're looking for opportunities, you really have to go someplace else. South Africa, with its renewable IPP auctions, was really sort of setting the standard for the world. And then that got gummed up for political reasons, and only this week is it getting sort of unstuck. And that was a true model. So South Africa was a good model as well. But often I'll tell people, I'll go through the whole continent and I'll say, wow, you know, it's really not easy. And then I say, well, that's why we have Power Africa. And we're also, you know, one of the nice things about being a development initiative is that we can experiment with things and try to figure out what works well. So if you take the IFC and the World Bank Scaling Solar Program, it's something that we put $6 million into early on, and we said we'd work in 3 countries. And it got great press, and it's made tremendous progress. But when they did the first competitive tender and solar prices came in between 6 and 8 cents a kilowatt hour, all of a sudden everybody else, all of our other partners who were negotiating deals all over the continent, the countries thought that they should suddenly get 6-cent solar power. And there were a lot of problems with that. It actually slowed deals down. So we have to be careful about, you know, in trying to help the market, that we're not harming the market as well. We're facing that in Nigeria right now, where we've had about a dozen partners who have been negotiating deals for a couple of years and investing a lot of money, and they were forced to bring their price down to 11 cents. And now their people are trying to force them to come down again. As long as you keep moving the goal line, you're going to scare off investment. Yeah. And when I've said Rwanda was good about this, they, you know, someone was trying to renegotiate like a 1 megawatt micro hydro project, and we said to them, just do the project. You know, 1 megawatt or 2 megawatts, it's not going to break the country's bank. You need to have something on the scoreboard where someone says, and everyone talks, and whether it's 2 megawatts or 500 megawatts, this is a good place to do business. And when people want to do business in your country, the cost of capital comes down, which will then drive down the prices of power as well, and you'll get more competitive bids. So the question is, just get the deals done. You don't have to get the absolute best deal, but just get some deals done.
Put something on the board. On the off-grid side, excuse me, I'm going to steal someone's water here. On the off-grid side, you know, we've seen an impressive story sort of unfold, both technologically and in business models, and the innovation and the mobile platforms that have kind of come along the way. Kind of a private sector-driven model, not a lot of subsidies. What can we do there? I mean, this is not something that we've really talked about, how to scale up and what the role of institutions are. How do we keep that going? What's the role of an organization like Power Africa?
So I think, look, the off-grid space is one of the most exciting spaces for a variety of reasons. I sat with a group this week, and they were talking about, everyone was talking about climate change. And I said, you know, if we spent 10% of the amount of time and 10% of the amount of resources focusing in the off-grid space, I think we would solve the climate change issues that people are concerned about. And we spend a lot of time on it, because what's going on is, in the off-grid space, you're giving people access to energy, and it's clean energy. But what's happening is that you're forcing people and companies to figure out how much productive service can you get out of a small piece of solar real estate. And it's driving energy efficiency. And I think Johanna's here. I think you'll hear from her later from Gogla. But at their conference, just seeing how that space has evolved and seeing the product offerings, my biggest criticism now of the on-grid space is that the distribution companies, they're like Kodak. It's like they're like a camera store. They haven't figured out how to keep up with the new trends. And I remember when Kodak, when digital cameras and even digital cameras first came out, I bought Kodak stock. I'm like, well, this is easy. Kodak will just buy SanDisk, and instead of getting film, you're gonna get a little, you know, get an SD card. And they never did it. I thought it was the dumbest thing ever. I mean. And so the distribution companies, they need to wake up. I wrote a blog that said this: wake up, discos. You know, you got to figure out what's going on. And they need to learn from the off-grid companies and look at their business models, because the off-grid companies are not selling electricity. What they're selling are productive services. They're leasing televisions. and they're getting customers at the early stage. So you're getting people who've never been banked before. You're getting them to pay with mobile phones. You're getting all that data associated with their payment habits, which means that you can then use that data for ad revenue. And they're only sort of scratching the surface of how to monetize all of that data that they have. Some companies like Phoenix are giving credit ratings to some of the poorest of the poor and giving them student loans. The distribution companies need to think differently or they're all going to go out of business. And most of them are pretty much insolvent right now anyway.
Yeah, it's a real clash of models, a consumer-focused model and kind of the classic utility model. I think we're out of time for our side conversation.